You want me to do it?
Oh. That's adorable.
Oh, honey.
Welcome to Uninformed Summary, where four friends get together and discuss historical figures or events and how they affect us today. My name is Molly. What's up? I'm not in the hot seat tonight. That honor goes to Matt.
It's me.
Next up is Vinny.
Hi, Matt.
Vinny.
And next up is me, Miss Molly. And last but not least is Scott.
Hello.
You're in for a real treat tonight.
So today I'm going to do part one of Dwight Eisenhower, and I'm going to approach it through the lens of perhaps what was the most important day of his life, which was June 6, 1944, commonly known as D-Day. Of course, later Eisenhower is going to become president during the Cold War, but before we can talk about Cold War Eisenhower, we need to talk about Hot War Eisenhower.
Hot
So just to give-
indeed.
So just blow through his early life. He was born on October 14th, 1890 in Denison, Texas, and his family moved to Abilene, Kansas in 1892, and he considered that his hometown for the rest of his life. He had a brother who was also known as Ike. His brother was Big Ike, and he was Little Ike. It only stuck with Dwight, and he became commonly known as that from then on. And he wanted to go to college, but instead in 1911, he went to West Point, where he was a very average student. He graduated in the middle of his class in 1915. And this class later became known as the class that the stars fell on, because 59 members eventually became general officers in the U.S. Army.
It's not that many.
It's a lot of generals. So after he graduated West Point, he basically established a pattern of getting like training and organization postings instead of combat assignments. Even in World War I, he never got a combat assignment. He did like planning and logistics and stuff like that, which seems boring and was frustrating to him early on in his career. But as we'll see later, it kind of laid the groundwork for what he needed to do in World War II. After World War I, he continued getting numerous training and kind of continuing development assignments. He went to colleges and stuff like that and learned the theory of war and logistics and stuff. He did briefly serve with and was not a huge fan of MacArthur, who's another big general and going to be another big influential general in World War II. And by 1939, when World War II is starting to heat up in Europe, he was known, he's like on people's radar, but he was known for his organizational abilities as a brigadier general, but he'd never held a command higher than a battalion, and he had never led men in combat at all, which, you know, on the face of it, going into World War II, that would make him a pretty unlikely guy to be in any major leadership role, because that was typically the route to high command, was that you would do combat commands and you would work your way up. But Ike had not taken that route.
That sounds familiar.
And
Yeah.
how old is he at this point when World War II is starting to pick up?
In 1939, he would be 49.
Okay, yeah, because
Yeah.
people who were fighting in that were young, very, very young.
Mm-hmm. And 39's pretty young for a general. I mean, he did move up the ranks relatively quickly, especially considering there wasn't a war on. But again, he had never had any combat commands, even during World War I, which was when people like Patton and a lot of his other contemporaries were having combat commands and moving up the ranks. So
That's wild.
kind of
That
a-
just reminds me of being in a garage band and being like, well, you got your first show. I'm just going to go ahead and open up for Led Zeppelin. So,
yeah, basically.
oh, the stadium's packed, and if you don't do great, everyone will die. Good luck.
Yeah, basically. And that's kind of how it went. So just to give a little bit of background on World War II, I'm not going to go deep into it, but prior to the U.S. entry in the war, World War II had been, like I said, ramping up since 1939 in Europe. It goes back a little bit further in Asia, depending on when you want to define the start date. In Europe, starting in 1939, Germany had overrun most of its neighbors in rapid. So they took Poland, they took Denmark, they took Norway, they took France, they took Yugoslavia. In Asia, Japan held much of northeast and coastal China. The Battle of Britain had narrowly been won, just barely keeping Britain in the fight. And U.S. was leaning more and more toward the Allied cause, but they had not joined yet. We were helping Britain out with a lot of material assistance and stuff like that, but hadn't actually entered the war. Harbor happens. Japan attacks us. Germany declares war on us shortly after. We declare war on Germany, and then it's on. We're on two fronts fighting Japan and Germany. So Eisenhower gets assigned to numerous staff posts, mostly doing high-level planning, again, like has been the pattern for the rest of his career. And eventually, he is made commander of the European theater. George Marshall is in charge of the U.S. Armed Forces in general, and he sees Eisenhower's talent at planning and logistics and stuff like that, and sees him as the perfect man to manage this really big, complicated, multi-front war that's going on in Europe. So fast forwarding again to 1944, so we're getting closer to D-Day. By 1944, the U.S. had invaded North Africa and then Sicily and then mainland Italy. And all of those operations, well, North Africa and Sicily, not the Italy thing, but those were both successful amphibious assaults that had been planned and executed by Eisenhower. So he's been getting experience in these smaller amphibious operations that are eventually paving the way for him to plan this huge undertaking that is D-Day, which turns out to be a masterpiece of planning, coordination, and logistics.
I mean, the ultimate paper-pushing general's dream. I mean, like,
Yeah.
this is risk, right?
Yeah.
Magnified on such a huge, because what's the goal? They were saying we need to make a whole new Western front with this operation inside of Hitler's controlled Europe. This is France. Like,
yeah, Russia was pushing really, really, really hard for a second front.
Yes.
And they didn't like Britain, like these like kind of compromised second fronts like Sicily and Italy and stuff, but Russia really wanted us to invade France. Britain wasn't too excited about it, but from the beginning, that was the U.S. goal, was we should just go straight at the Nazis, hit them where they're strong, and end the war. You know, the shortest route to Berlin is through France.
Yeah, seemingly a really crazy brave move, though. And even more like, to me, it seems even more wild because of the weather risks, like all the like the different things they had to do to keep it, well, even under wraps. But I'm sure you're getting there.
Oh yeah, and that leads right into my next point. So just a note on terminology: the Overlord was the all-encompassing everything around D-Day, and I'm going to get to in a second, there were a ton of operations besides just the actual landing of troops on June 6th. And in fact, the landing of troops on June 6th was like, when you think about it, it was really just like the cherry on the top of the sundae. There's months and even years of preparation that went into this thing before everything culminated on like that one day. So Overlord is the whole thing. Neptune is, and that's what everybody usually calls this, Operation Overlord, but that's the whole thing. Neptune was the landings on June 6th. So prior to this podcast, somebody asked me, why Normandy? There's surely lots of beaches in France that you could land on, but why Normandy? So for an amphibious operation to be successful, you need two things. First thing is you do need a beach that you can land on, which there are a lot of, but not every beach is landable.
Yeah, some are real sons of beaches.
I think they learned this in 1942 in there was this doomed operation that happened in a different beach, actually. Yeah, Dieppe.
Yeah.
A closer but less passable beach, and absolute failure. So I think they had learning lessons.
Yeah, they did learn a lot from Dieppe, and they learned a lot about beaches, like stuff that you wouldn't even think of, like the composition of sand and the tides and the exits off of the beach and all kinds of stuff that you wouldn't necessarily think of when planning these things, but all that stuff mattered.
I just imagine that they've sent like military people like out to like the beaches, and someone's like, "You guys looking for metal of some sort?" It's like, "I'm starting a war."
No, dude, they basically did that though. Yeah,
they did that.
They would take commandos in submarines and launch them, maybe a half mile out in the ocean, and they would swim in, take a little device and take a sample of the sand, and then take it back so that it could be analyzed, because the sand mattered. Like, there's some sand you can drive a tank over, and there's some sand that you can't drive a tank over, and you definitely don't want to land on a beach where it's the one where you can't drive a tank over.
And what's cool about Normandy as a beach, as a choice of landing, is that their sand was like kind of Goldilocks, like not too soft, not too hard, perfect, so to speak. But they still had to build like these. The Allies had to build these like interesting adaptations onto their tanks to get them up that sand, which it's just incredible. I was the one who asked, why Normandy, but
which most didn't make onto the beach.
Yeah, a lot of them still didn't get it.
Depending on which beach, and we'll get into that when we talk about the actual landings. But yeah,
did they Christopher
Columbus?
Columbus
for a second want to step away and be like, really hard day to be Dwight D. Eisenhower. I think he basically had the last call on like the "Are we doing this, boss?" question, and he had to say yes, and
he absolutely did.
What a pressure, man.
Yeah, and it was a hard decision. We'll get to that in a minute, but yeah, big decision. All right. So we said the first thing you need is a landable beach for an amphibious operation. The second thing you need is a port, because once you land, you're going to have to keep fighting, and to fight, you're going to need food and ammunition and medical supplies, etc. And you can't just take that over a beach, typically. Again, we'll get into that a little bit later.
Crusty, sandy beach. But they had a port to the west of their landing site, right?
They did. Cherbourg was the port that they wanted to capture. But they also decided that in case we don't capture Cherbourg, or in case Cherbourg isn't good enough, or maybe the Germans have blown it up or something, they actually made a plan to make fake harbors. They're called mulberry harbors, and they prefabricated them in England, towed them across the channel, and then sunk them and created artificial harbors, 2 of these, one in the American zone and one in the British zone. Yeah. So they're like, that's the backup plan, just in case we don't capture Cherbourg fast enough.
Dedicated.
Yeah, it's pretty wild. So again, that's just one example of like the extensive planning that went into this thing. So I mentioned that there are other operations that went before Operation Neptune to make Overlord a success. So one of those was Point Blank, which was an air campaign. And so for months and months and months, the Allied strategic bombing campaign focused on fuel and aircraft production and airfields, so that when June 6th finally rolled around, the Germans would have basically 0 air force. And they succeeded in that. I think there were like 2 German planes that flew over the landing beaches on D-Day, and those were the only 2 German planes that were in the sky for the whole time.
Or left.
Yeah, basically. I mean, it was suicide to fly against the Allies at that point, because they had such undisputed air superiority. And then after Point Blank, once it got a little bit closer to D-Day, they switched over to the transport plan. And that was another air campaign. And the point of this one was to isolate Normandy. So they just took the whole region of Normandy and bombed the shit out of any way to get into it. So any major bridges, any major rail hubs. They had fighter bombers strafing trains so that the Germans wouldn't have as many trains. And so they just they wanted it to be, when we attack on Normandy, we want it to be as hard as possible for any additional resources to get in there and oppose us.
Could you imagine being on that train?
Yeah, I know, right?
It's like, we have no like response to, like, what, are we going to throw hot coal at them?
Right. And it was incredibly effective. I mean, trains are really easy targets to hit. Like, they can't dodge. They're literally on rails. So they're really easy to hit.
Nah, they made a left turn. We almost had them.
This goes into my astonishment, rather, about how no, I guess it's supply lines, but it goes along with how many civilians were at play in terms of what you could bomb now.
Yeah. And it is interesting to note that Eisenhower did weigh on, he went back and forth a little bit on whether or not to do certain aspects of the transport plan, like bombing major rail hubs, because those are typically like in city centers. And To be fair, the U.S. did try as much as possible to only like bomb military targets. That was their policy. And this was kind of an exception to that general policy. And he knew a lot of civilians were going to die by ordering them to bomb those rail centers. But in the end, they decided, it's worth it. So
yeah, it's got to be 6 of one and half dozen.
Yeah, I mean, you're trying to choose the lesser evil. So, but yeah, it is kind of like a different way of thinking than we think now. Like, it would be unthinkable to just like, destroy a city center now. But back then it was pretty, unfortunately, common.
Wow.
Yeah. So there's one more operation that went in before Neptune to try and increase the chances of success. And that one is
Project Uranus.
No, that was actually a Russian operation. We'll cover that in another podcast.
I actually believe you.
It's true. I'm not lying. But today we're talking about D-Day. So we're talking about Operation Fortitude, which was a deception operation. This one was not an air power or anything like that. This was just straight trickery. They created a whole fake U.S. Army group, which would be like hundreds and thousands of men, is what an army group is. And they put it under Patton, who was the general that the Germans like most feared or respected, or, however you want to put it. They thought Patton was one of our best generals. And so they put Patton in charge of this fake army. And they had a whole network of people pretending to be this army. They had all fake radio sets. They would talk to each other with fake traffic. So I would just be like, hey, Scott, this is First Company. We're short on machine gun ammunition. Can you send some more? And you'd be like, yep, I'll send you some more because we're invading France. And like they wanted to be like so out in the open about it, but they generated all this fake radio traffic. They built fake military camps that nobody was in. They even made inflatable tanks that they would put in the fake military camps. And they made all this radio traffic seem like they were going to invade a totally different place than they actually were going to invade.
Don't worry.
Weren't they inspired by a magician?
I think so, yeah.
To do that?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, the British especially were really big on deception type stuff. And it worked really well, as we'll find out when we actually get to the day. So overall, just to summarize the planning, we've got all these operations that go on for like a year before we even get to D-Day. We've got, in the end, it's going to be about 1,200 planes for the initial airborne assault. There's going to be an amphibious assault of about 5,000 vessels altogether, and nearly 160,000 troops are going to cross the channel on June 6th. And that easily makes it the largest amphibious assault ever conducted in the history of human.
Man, that is just thinking. I couldn't count that high between the time the podcast starts and ends.
Yeah, it boggles the mind. And the mind behind all of it was Dwight Eisenhower.
I mean, he really did pull the trigger from the Allied expedition front's standpoint. He was the trigger man. That is again that pressure. It makes me want to pee a little thinking about just doing that.
Yeah. So June 6th. Well, actually June 4th rolls around, and we talked about tides before. So there's a narrow window from June 4 to 6 where the invasion can go through because the tides are right. You want, without boring you with too much detail, there's a narrow time when the tide is low enough that you can get close to where you want to get on the beach and avoid certain obstacles, and it's not too high, and that you'll be too close. So there's this narrow window where the tide is just right where you want to land. So he had this window from June 4 to 6, and June 4 rolls around and the weather is shitty. There's really, really rough seas. It's raining. It's going to make air coordination trouble. It's going to make the landings a mess. And so they postpone. So they postpone the first day. They're supposed to land on June 5. Eisenhower calls it off. The next day rolls around and it's not looking good. The weather is still a mess. But so they have one last meeting. He gets everybody together, asks what they think. Everybody's pretty much saying we can't go. The weather's too bad. And the meteorologist says, look, I'm looking at the weather map, and it looks like there's probably a window. On the morning of June 6th, we'll have decent weather for a couple hours. And hypothetically, that's enough to get everybody ashore without much problems.
So they've just got an air traffic controller there that's just like, well, we gotta delay the war by 2 hours. So if everyone can just wait by gate B, it'll be fine, we think.
Well, and it's kind of a nightmare airport situation. That's actually a pretty good analogy because all these guys are on boats.
Yeah, they're waiting.
They're put them on boats the night of June 4, and when it got called off, they don't go back to their camps. They stay on the boat all night in these bad seas. So
take this meal voucher.
And they're all getting seasick and throwing up on each other.
And they're nervous. It's horrible. Yeah, it's horrible.
I saw photos of guys crammed in the boat so hard that you know that he could not have gotten from the middle of the boat to the side of the boat. They were just jam-packed. It was just
throwing up in their helmets.
Yeah. It was a bad time. And so
this is the worst ferry ever.
Given this possible couple hour window, Eisenhower dismisses everybody, and he's got to make the decision on whether or not it should go or not. And in the end, he says, yeah, if we've got a chance, otherwise we don't have another chance for I think it was a couple months, or maybe 1 month. I think it's the middle of July. So he says, all right, let's go. And he actually had in his pocket, he had a speech written for what he would say if it was a failure. He was going to resign his position and take full responsibility for the failure if it didn't work. And spoiler alert, luckily he never had to use that.
Cojones.
Yeah.
I'm sure his butthole was puckered at first, but
again, never been in combat led, right? Never took anybody to combat. Oh, hey man, why don't you do the biggest one yet?
Yeah, it's pretty wild. And it's just kind of I think Eisenhower is the prototypical World War II general, just because of that. Because it was so much of an industrial logistics war. Not to say that it wasn't, crazy on the front lines and stuff like that, but to a large extent it was won by a lot of technology and industry and stuff like that. And so it's kind of fitting that the American general from World War II was a guy who had never led in combat.
Oof. Just an amazing first job. My first job was washing dishes. I washed dishes at a Holiday Inn.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. All right, so we finally get to June 6th, or want to be technical, the early hours of June 5, or the late hours of June 5. So the first thing that happens on D-Day is there's a coded message broadcast over the BBC radio that alerts the French resistance and some operatives in France that the invasion is on. So that sets in motion all these plans. There's all these French resistance cells all over France, and they're all supposed to, do whatever they can to harass the Germans. So blow up bridges, sabotage fuel supplies, all kinds of mayhem. And it's debatable how much of this stuff helped, but that was the first stuff that started happening late in the night before any Allied soldier had set foot in France. Then after that came the airborne landings. They happened overnight. And basically the goal of the airborne landings was to land on the two ends of the Normandy area and just prevent any reinforcements from coming in and overrunning the beaches before everybody could get firmly ashore there. And the aforementioned bad weather played havoc with the airborne landings. This is also kind of an experimental thing at this point in the war. So they got scattered all over the place. A very large percentage of them missed their landing zones, and they just ended up scattered all over Normandy. And it's debated whether or not this was a good or bad thing. They didn't really meet most of their objectives, but it's an argument to be made is that by them being all over the place, they kind of created more of a distraction than they would have if they had all landed in one place, because it kind of gave the impression that paratroopers are landing everywhere. Everywhere you think all these reports are coming in. Oh, there's paratroopers here. There's paratroopers here. And it kind of gives the impression that they're paratroopers everywhere.
Well, some of the paratroopers were not even paratroopers.
Mm-hmm.
What do you mean?
They were little mannequins, stuff with bombs.
Yeah, they did drop some fake paratroopers as well. Yeah,
is that more of that British deception that you were talking about? Yeah, there you go. It's classic.
Yeah,
right. Think of all those little things that helped.
Yeah, because I mean, anytime you get a report of paratroopers, they're sending somebody to check it out. So you're kind of dispersing all the German soldiers that are looking for these paratroopers. Because at this point, they still thought it was a raid. Again, going back to the deception and the fact that the weather was so bad really played into the Allies' hands, because the Germans, a lot of the German officers had gone on leave. They were back in Germany or, doing whatever, because they thought
a huge factor.
Yeah, because they thought an invasion was possible because the weather was so bad. Like, nobody would land in this mess. So,
dude, imagine being like one of those German people that were like, really heavy on getting their kill count up. Like, dude, I got 15 today, and they go down there and they all say Sears on the back of the head.
Yeah, so the airborne troops are on the ground now. They're raising hell all over the place. And then the first people ashore, as far as amphibious landings, are some Rangers and Commandos. American Rangers land at Point du Hoc. Some Commandos land on the far eastern end of the beaches. And these are like really early special forces types. And they have specific missions, usually to take out artillery batteries that can fire on the invasion beaches. So they kind of get in there while it's still dark, start doing their thing. And most of them are successful in accomplishing their goals. So finally, just at daybreak, starting from west to east, because that's the way the tides worked, that's how the landings worked. So on the far west, we've got Utah, and next is Omaha. Those are both American beaches, as you can probably tell from the names. And then next is Gold, which is a British beach, Juno, which is a Canadian beach, and all the way to the east is Sword Beach, which is another British beach.
Yeah, for a second you confused me by thinking like, dude, they messed up Normandy a lot. They were they landed in America and Britain. Got one guy in New Zealand trying to learn how to speak, the language.
Utah seems awfully far away from the American state.
Got that Utah beach.
I didn't even know Utah had beaches.
That weather you were talking about, like the winds were like blowing everybody. Like that's crazy, man. You blown up with. Well, we were supposed to land here.
Oklahoma.
There goes our beach.
They got a bunch of these fucking German Mormons.
Went all the way from Omaha to Utah.
Yeah, and like you said, the winds did blow everybody off course. On Utah, they landed pretty low opposition, not many casualties, but they did land in the wrong place, which actually kind of turned out to work out for them because there was less defenses there. There's a moment they're like, well, do we try and re-embark and re-land? And the general in charge was like, nope, we're going to start the war from here. And that's what they did. Everything else went pretty much according to plan on Gold, Juno, and Sword Beach as well. There was some resistance, obviously, but all that months and years of preparation paid off, and everything pretty much went as planned, and they met most of their objectives. Except on Omaha. Omaha was the only brutal beach, and that's probably the one that is the most well-known. Like, if you've played some of the early Call of Duty games or you've seen Saving Private Ryan, Omaha Beach is that one. Everything that could go wrong did go wrong on Omaha. I wrote an entire book about what went wrong on Omaha. I'll give you the short version. There happened to be really good German troops on Omaha Beach, so that was part of the problem. Another problem was most of the tanks sank before they got to the beach, which Molly alluded to earlier. So they had no fire support. They got blown way off course, so they landed in the wrong spot. And unlike on Utah Beach, the wrong spot was worse than the right spot in this case. So they had a really rough time. So on Omaha, the first wave was completely ineffective. They did not meet their objectives, and they stayed pinned down on the beach, and they couldn't get off. At one point, it's debated how much, but the general in charge, who was not Eisenhower, this was, I think, Bradley, was considering pulling the plug on Omaha and just saying, okay, those guys are a write-off. We didn't get Omaha. Let's direct everybody that was supposed to go to Omaha to Utah, and we'll just go from there. And that's part of the reason why they had 5 beaches. They're like, okay, if we have 5 beaches, we can lose one, and the operation can still succeed.
That's just amazing consideration of how much you're fighting over space and time at one point in time.
Yeah.
All one day, all like 5 beaches. It's like 5 fingers of a hand moving together at the same time. Except the hand is all over Western, like France.
Right.
But Omaha in particular, they had like 5 of the most powerful guns ever just hammering into these troops. So they
German guns.
Yeah. Couldn't go anywhere. It was like 25 bullets per second.
Oh, that's come on, you could jump over that.
It's like 1,500 a minute. Like
I jumped over a bullet once.
Insane.
That's insane.
Yeah, it was hellish.
How do you fight that? And you're like, okay, onto the beach. First line of guys in front of you just falls down. Okay, never mind.
They're seeing their friends being ripped in half by bullets and shrapnel.
Yeah, if you've never seen Saving Private Ryan, the first like 20 minutes of it are incredibly brutal and incredibly realistic as to what the conditions were on that beach. And they also do a pretty good job. I mean, even though it's fictional, they do a really good job of portraying what actually happened and how Omaha Beach eventually was actually taken. So it basically just broke down into small groups of men because they weren't in the right place. They were all mixed up. So like you weren't even with like people of your unit. It was just a whole bunch of mixed up people, and a bunch of junior officers, got whoever was around them together and said like, look, we're either going to die on this beach or we can die, trying to get off this beach. And so that's what they did. In small groups, they moved forward. There's some crazy stories from the Navy too. Some destroyers saw what was going on and that it wasn't going well on Omaha Beach, and they drove dangerously close to the shore. Like they were risking running their ships aground. They got so close so that they could literally just blast 5-inch gun shells right, where the people on the beach, people on the beach were giving them hand signals, like right there. And they were so close that they could like see that and put direct fire right where the people on the beach needed it. So between just improvised stuff like that and small groups just acting on their own initiative, they were eventually able to clear Omaha Beach by the end of the day.
Started 6 in the morning.
3 hours in, it's like, when is it my turn to get shot?
Right. Yeah.
Oh my God. I think it's unpleasant to have a fireworks show go more than 10 minutes.
Yeah. You got to keep in mind also that aside from some of one regiment on Omaha Beach, almost all the troops that were going ashore, like most of them, this was their first combat. Because like all the troops that had fought in like Sicily and stuff, like I said, with a few exceptions, most of them were still down in the Mediterranean fighting in Italy. So these were, for the most part, fresh forces that, were conscripts and had never fought a war before. And this was their first experience with combat.
Some were even underage.
Yeah.
That's scandalous.
Mm-hmm.
Sneaking their way into the military.
Yeah, the military piece of that glory.
Yeah, the military largely turned a blind eye to it too.
Yeah, what? No way. Don't. That's crazy.
Yeah.
Like a bad bouncer.
Bad bouncer.
And put your book back by the door and you're in.
They didn't, yeah. It's either that or, we'd have to replace one of those bags we're throwing out of the airplane.
Right. So by the end of day one, the goals had largely been met. There was a few goals that weren't met. The city of Caen, which is spelled Caen, was not captured, which was one of the major goals. It was a big transportation hub. Big historical debate over why it wasn't captured on day one and whether it could have been captured on day one, but that's not really important. But for the most part, they had met their goals. They had gotten ashore with everybody who was supposed to get ashore. And they had a foothold in France that they, in the end, weren't ever going to be removed from. So yeah, that's D-Day. Like I said, probably the most significant day of Dwight Eisenhower's life, and maybe I would argue, one of the more significant days in the 20th century. So I asked for questions before I this episode, and one of the questions that Scott asked kind of jokingly is why not just nuke everything and then go in? And aside from the fact that we didn't have nuclear weapons ready yet, that's actually kind of an instructive question, because why wouldn't we if we could? And part of why it was so important was that we actually wanted to take that territory over, because at this point Germany was pretty well defeated. Like, they weren't defeated yet, but like the writing was on the wall by 1944. So everybody was thinking past the war on Germany and thinking, what is Europe going to look like? What is the world going to look like after this war is over? And so taking land became really important, because you had the Russians coming in from the east on Germany, and you had the Allies coming in on the west. And so taking a lot of land was important. So aside from wanting to defeat the Germans as quickly as possible, it was important that we take control of as many countries as possible, so that they would be more inclined to be aligned with us after the war was over.
As opposed to dropping another nuke on their soil.
Right. And there's also a big debate of whether or not we would have used atomic weapons on Europe. Pretty contentious debate. Like, some people were like, yeah, of course we would have. It's a military weapon. Why wouldn't we use it? And then some people argue, well, it was a lot easier for us to use nuclear weapons on Japan because, there's a lot of racism at the time, and we considered them, not civilized people. So maybe it was a lot easier for us to pull the trigger then. So I don't really know where I come down on that debate, but it's an interesting question.
Well, wasn't Eisenhower's call anyway. That was, He was all up in D-Day.
Yeah.
It was a hell of a job interview.
Yeah.
the concept of, I was like, so what have you done for the country? Well, funny thing. Only the biggest casualty thing that I can think of in like the last 100 years, if you want to count that, it's fine.
Yeah, that was a lot of lives lost, right? Like, it was like 10,000 troops or something in the five beaches from the Allied sides, and like all kinds of vehicles and stuff. And then like
they had about 10,000 casualties with 4,000 confirmed dead.
Yeah. That is just confirmed. The other ones floated away, dude.
Yeah. I mean, that's
like,
a lot of people missing gone. That. Yeah.
So that brings about a story that this friend of ours told us today. Speaking of like the bodies floating away. So a super pleasant story. But we were talking with friends today about the episode we were gonna do. And our friend's like, oh, I have a grandpa who served in World War II. And that's not uncommon, right?
Mm-hmm.
So she says that he was on the third wave, because they had multiple waves of people being commanded to go onto the beaches at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
And he was actually drunk, passed out on homemade alcohol that he had made in his like cabin. With his, his whole platoon was sent out wave 1, and wave 1 did not make it. So he errantly got sent out on wave 3, which by the time at this point, like, his description to the family members that she remembers now was there were so many bodies in the water that the boat was just stuck.
Jesus.
So what was the solution? Well, so grandpa's like, I'm not getting off this boat, right? And the general put a gun, or the person in charge of him, I suppose, the officer, put a gun to his head. And he's like, yes, you are. So he did. And made it out and made it up and survived. She said he went on to survive the 5 like most major battles of World War II through the tactic of, and I kid you not, she said this, just hiding under stacks of dead bodies.
Jesus.
Gather around, kids. I wanna regale you with stories of my time when I was younger. Oh, I understand getting up at 7 a.m. is pretty hard. Did I ever tell you about the time that there was guns pointed at officers as I hid under the dead bodies and carcasses of those around me, people I once called friends, and we used to play checkers, actually, well, before they died, and I hid under their body and used it as some sort of revenant bear corpse.
I was supposed to be part of the band.
Yeah, that's what she said, that he was going to be an instrumentalist in the band, but then they just, nope, you're
Gave him a gun instead.
They're like, haha, we got you. And, what his advantageous characteristic was that he was short. And apparently that mean for him, bullets just whizzed overhead. And, if he was the low man.
Because the
Small
Allied
hitbox.
soldiers were described as tall, like, farmers.
Mm-hmm. So
he was short enough to where the bullets were just flying over his head.
It's so crazy. It's so that so needs to be the last one of those wars.
Yeah. Yeah, the casualties are just insane. While you were talking, I was looking at Omaha. He probably landed at Omaha. Estimates are between 2,000 and 5,000 killed, wounded, and missing on just Omaha.
Wow.
You know what I mean? Like it's like how many months of the forever wars that we fight now, like for casualty numbers like that. That was freaking one day in World War II.
If they would have just listened to the guy, that we wouldn't have done this.
Right.
He made a pretty substantial contribution to like talking about that, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that'll be part 2, the military industrial complex.
Oh, let's do it now.
Well, I made the joke earlier about how my grandfather was in World War II. Obviously not a Nazi, but fun fact is that at my mother's house there are actual like Nazi memorabilia. There's a box of Nazi memorabilia from like Nazis that he killed, and he was in the Battle of the Bulge. And this is 100% true story. Is at some point during the war he hit a landmine and survived it, but it messed up. It turned him colorblind. It switched reds and greens in his eyes. So if you wanted a really fun roller coaster, you would let him drive.
Oh no.
Yeah, like a bizarro world driver.
You let him do what he wants, man.
Yeah.
He went and he came back. My father's father was in the war too, and I think a lot of people could tell that story, right, in our generation. And
I think my grandpa was in the war.
Yeah, I have my grandpa was a bomber, and I have his uniform shirt, the drab, but he was in planes bombing. I mean, that was
Your
what he did.
grandpa?
Yeah,
grandpa was a bomber.
that's the bomb.
Bombardier.
Bombardier. Yeah, I think if you get a survey of people in our
my dad's dad
age group, it'd be hard not to find that similarity.
Yeah.
Wow.
And now we're here. Because once they came back, they started fucking.
Yeah, they boomed those babies out real good. Huh?
They sure did.
When you mentioned the Rangers making it across the beach or like up the cliff.
I actually scaled some cliffs at Point du Hoc.
Yeah, so apparently they were like looking for heavy artillery that the Germans were, supposedly hiding. But when they got there, there was nothing.
Yep.
Or of deception, like you said, they were deceiving each other always.
Why didn't the Rangers just put all of their, weapons together and form like a Megazord situation?
Oh, they did.
Okay.
That's how we killed Hitler.
Yep. You never heard about Megazord and versus Hitler? Versus Mecha Hitler?
Yeah, Mecha Hitler. Yeah. You guys remember that episode of Power Rangers, the movie?
I am Megazord.
That's how Berlin got destroyed.
Yeah, there's still Megazord footprints in Berlin today.
Yeah.
They named it after General Megazord.
These big concrete towers. Those are Mecha Hitler charging ports.
German flak towers. Yeah, it was just a front. Isn't that crazy though? They had flak towers that
those things are wild. Like some of them are still standing because they would be so expensive to destroy. Like they're built so sturdily. Like they're like, well, we'll just leave it.
It's going to be 1,000-year reign, so we could keep around the big old flak towers for a while. Maybe we hold some really interesting dance parties there. Something. 1,000 years of peace.
You want sin?
No, we didn't. Yeah, fuck you, dude. We're good. I'd rather have my limited freedoms, please.
Mecha
I
Hitler.
would. Don't tell me, yeah, Mecha Hitler. But he still talks. He's pleasant. Yeah, I am 600 feet tall. Mecha Hitler's like evil, like catchline is like, now hit the shoppers, or something like that.
Why is this Mecha Hitler gay?
Oh, cause fuck Hitler. Every depiction of Hitler should be marred by, if not outright parody, then slander.
I don't know.
Ribald at best.
I don't know what he was, but he was strange in the sexuality department for sure.
He's high on Ritalin. That was his problem.
He was high on a lot of shit.
Yeah, if you do that much meth, you're gonna
read Blitzed. That dude did a lot of drugs.
I think they said they were putting handfuls of just whatever, and he would just take it all designed to like uber make his mind like super.
Yeah, he had this quack doctor that just like they basically just like he didn't know what he was doing, and so he just kept him obliterated most of the time.
Yeah, overdoing like overloading his liver and shit, and then like it's just awful. No wonder he was such a wreck.
Well, if you've got, the Nazis were doing all kinds of stuff according to every movie I've ever seen, in which they're like putting dogs on like, skateboard, dog heads on skateboards and making that into a creature. I would imagine that if they can do those kinds of like weird experiment stuff and a doctor's like, we've also learned how to make you stronger. And it's like, just take this pile of arsenic, basically. I would believe him, I was like, yeah, you got fucking dog head skateboards, man. Like, I'll eat whatever you hand me.
But if you are a twin,
I
definitely want you.
I didn't like that.
Yeah. All right.
I just posted a bunch of sources if you would include those.
Yeah. Do you want to go ahead and hit that real quick as the sources for...
Oh yeah, sure. So a lot of this I've just done from memory, but the big four books that I've read that most of this probably came from. One is called Why the Allies Won by Richard Overy, which is a book about the war in general. But of course, there's
Don't do it, Scott.
Continue.
One is a what?
Nothing.
I'm
12 years old.
I'm
what just happened.
Scott, I'm gonna make sure Scott doesn't make an Overy joke.
I didn't even think about it. The next one is A War to Be Won by Williamson, Murray, and Alan Millett. Again, that's a good general history of World War II. D-Day by Stephen Ambrose. Stephen Ambrose is kind of like a pop historian, but he can write pretty well when he's not plagiarizing other people, and it's a good book focused on just D-Day. And if you want to really zoom in on Omaha Beach and why it went so foobar, that we didn't go into fully in the episode, you can read Omaha Beach, A Flawed Victory by Adrian Lewis.
Yeah.
It's very flawed.
Well, on that note, we're going to call an end to this week's episode. If you do care to follow us on Twitter, you can follow Matt at Matchroll20. You can follow Molly at Malswald, I believe it is, MOLSWALD. You can follow me at That One Loud Guy, and you can follow Vinny at John Stamos. Molly.
Don't forget to like and subscribe.
Woo! Good job, Matt.
Yeah.
We'll see you next week.
Yeah. Thanks, guys.